The world is experiencing a large number of youth intellectuals who have been to school for like 15 and 20 years or even 24 years of schooling. These are the most tender years or tender ages, being exposed to books, being exposed to thousands and thousands of books. These are the textbooks, these are exercise books. So this is a generation that is very intellectual and very knowledgeable. This is a generation that you can only appeal to through the use of reason. This is a generation that will not take anything that's just an opinion. So they'll only follow that which appeals to reason, that which appeals to right judgment of things. This is a generation that has been exposed to boarding schools because 60% of the young youths that we have right now are a byproduct of boarding schools. So boarding schools are kind of concentration camps to make these youths just be focused on learning and on books. So in this boarding school, they had a lot of examinations, they had a lot of preps, they had a lot of early morning reading. So some of these boarding schools wake up at 4 a.m., go to class, do a thorough study before breakfast. Then after supper, they do a thorough study till they go to bed. And so when this routine is repeated over and over and over and over and over again, while these youths are tender and ready to learn and very susceptible to adopting new skills. So when this tendency is repeated, it tends to create a form of individuals that are very knowledgeable, that are very intellectual, that are very informed, that have been exposed to a lot of knowledge. So such a generation is a very dangerous one, especially to people who love just believing in things or just saying things from personal opinions. They'll face a lot of questions. They have, every teacher must be ready to face a generation that is ready, and it's very ready to question anything. The examination papers taught these youths to question, because when you are exposed to a lot of questions in a year, midterm exams, end-term exams, weekly exams in other schools. So when you're exposed to such a generation, then be ready to be to deal with a lot of questions, to deal with a byproduct of a lot of learning, a lot of books, products, a lot of schooled and very knowledgeable individuals. When you are exposed to such a generation, then one must be ready to handle a generation that has been taught and been cultured and been nurtured, been made addicts of learning, of constant learning. So to appeal to this young generation, these Gen Zs, these millennials, this young generation, one will have to appeal to them through the intellect. Because after all that learning, after all that exposure to books, that tendency cannot just be shaken off easily. It is still embedded deep in them. And so the moment they notice something that appeals to that which they've been nurtured to do, when they come across an individual who's an intellectual, who uses reasoning rather than emotions or just belief, they might drift towards that direction, because they will notice something that appeals to that which they were conditioned to do, to that which they were conditioned to practice since their early age. Because remember, a child is taken to school at the age of 4 years, and by the time he or she finishes from 4, he or she is almost 20. So that's very many years of programming and of being habituated to a certain behavior. And so when they have been habituated to such a behavior, while they are tender, while they are susceptible to learning, while they are ready to learn new things, then that tends to shape their future. That tends to create youths who are schooled, who are knowledgeable, who are intellectuals, who are a byproduct of very many books. So to appeal to such a generation, one will have to appeal to them through reason, through reasoning and through rational thought, because one must be very factual in how one conveys his teachings. Otherwise, they'll examine him with the examination that the math subject used to examine formulas with. So they will examine this individual, this teacher, this pastor, or this individual trying to impart knowledge unto them, and they'll judge him with a very skeptical and intellectual thought. So it's hard to appeal to like 1,000 youths whose each and everyone's thought is intellectual and reasonable and capable of great reasoning, because when one is exposed to a certain thing for a very long time, it tends to turn into his or her own habit. Just as when you find a mechanic who has practiced mechanic for like 15 years, you expect to meet a pro in mechanics. When you meet a mason who has done masonry for 20 years, then you expect to meet a person who is great at masonry. When you meet a driver who has done driving for more than 15 years, then you expect to meet a professional driver. So these years do not just go in vain, especially the tender and young years of one's life. So if those tender and young years of one's life are byproducts of a lot of knowledge, a lot of intellectual knowledge, a lot of scholarly knowledge, then you expect to meet a byproduct of that who will be a professional intellectual, a person who has been exposed to intellectual knowledge, a person who has been exposed to facts and to research and to a lot of experiments and a lot of knowledge overall. So that kind of an individual will be very skeptical in his approach on life. That individual will be very intellectual in how he examines arguments, discussions, opinions. So when you meet such a brain, then one must be very careful, one must be very skilled, one must be very intellectual to an extent that whenever they'll reason out your argument, they'll come to a conclusion of the factualness of what you claim, the truth in what you teach, the facts behind what you claim or what you want to propagate into their brains. So this is a generation that is very dangerous when it comes to teachers, to pastors. They might deconstruct all the things that do not add up in an argument, and they'll conclude by giving you marks on how much true your opinions are, how much misguided your opinions are. These are individuals who will do research of things that you tell them. They've been taught to learn. They've been cultured and been nurtured and been habituated to constant learning. So they'll use the internet to continue that habit that does not die easily. So that habit will be just, they will not use books. They'll use the internet to research. And remember, the internet has the data from everywhere across the world. So you might teach them about Thomas Aquinas, and they'll later go and research about what you claimed. So the moment one is not well informed, then one is in danger of teaching or of being bashed by this young generation. So this is a generation prone to books, prone to research, prone to learning, prone to questioning, prone to and nurtured to be in constant learning, constant schooling. So such a generation is a very knowledgeable one, is a very intellectual one, and that will require a very intellectual teacher, a very intellectual preacher, a very intellectual pastor, and a very intellectual way of giving points or driving home facts to impart to them knowledge. One should be very knowledgeable and very factual based. Otherwise, they'll dispose him and find a more intellectual, a more reasoning teacher who can appeal to their state of being, to their acquired habits.